All right, so let's dive into something that really kind of caught my eye. Picture this: you're responsible for the UK Ministry of Defence, staring down a 29 billion Hauna budget gap. Would you be signing off on millions in taxi fares? Probably not the first thing that springs to mind, right?
Yeah, probably not.
Well, that's exactly what we're unpacking today. We've got this recent Mail Online article that exposes some, shall we say, interesting spending habits within the MoD. Over £2 million spent on taxis and chauffeurs in a single year, enough to cover the salaries of 83 privates. It's not just about the money, though. It's what this spending might reveal about priorities, especially in a world that feels increasingly unstable.
Yeah, it is fascinating, isn't it? You'd think with a budget shortfall that large, every penny would be scrutinized. And of course, the MoD is a massive organization, personnel all over the place, some in remote locations. So transportation is definitely a legitimate need.
Oh, absolutely. It's not like everyone can just hop on the tube. But even acknowledging that, there's a quote from Colonel Philip Ingram, a former British intelligence officer. That really stuck with me. He calls this spending a symptom of a much deeper problem.
Colonel Ingram is raising a good point about accountability, or the lack thereof. His argument is that this kind of spending is indicative of a culture within the MoD, where financial decisions aren't being made with the utmost care, maybe even a bit of a disconnect from the realities of the budget situation.
And it's not just him sounding the alarm. The article highlights the fact that the British Army is on track to be its smallest in over 200 years. So we have these two seemingly contradictory actions, spending lavishly on taxis while simultaneously downsizing the army. What kind of message does that send, not just to potential adversaries, but also to our allies, who are in many cases increasing their defense spending?
Right. That's the core question, isn't it? It makes you wonder about the MoD's strategic vision. In a world where threats are constantly evolving, are they truly prepared for a future where conventional warfare might not be the only, or even the primary concern? This spending on taxis, when viewed against the backdrop of a shrinking army, raises questions about whether the MoD is adapting quickly enough to a changing global landscape.
And speaking of changing landscapes, Colonel Ingram doesn't mince words. He compares the current geopolitical climate to 1938, right before the outbreak of World War II. That's not a comparison you make lightly.
No, it's not. It's a stark warning for sure. And to fully grasp its weight, we need to consider what a 1938 moment might look like today. Back then, the world was on the brink of a catastrophic conflict, and many failed to see the warning signs or take them seriously enough. Ingram's point is that we need to be exceptionally vigilant, especially given the complexity of modern warfare. Cyber attacks, misinformation campaigns, economic warfare. These are all threats that weren't on the radar in 1938, but they're very real today. Underestimating these new forms of conflict could have devastating consequences. It's almost like he's saying, look, we might be facing a whole different kind of war. And maybe taxis aren't the best use of resources right now.
Exactly. And if we connect this back to the shrinking army, the question becomes even more pressing. If we're facing more diverse, more complex threats, how can we justify reducing our manpower? It suggests a potential mismatch between the MoD's stated priorities and their actions. Now, of course, the article does present the Maldives side of the story. They emphasize the need for secure transport, especially for personnel traveling to locations that aren't easily accessible by public transportation. And they stress that all travel requests are carefully vetted to ensure they're essential and represent value for money. But even with that explanation,
it's a fair point, but it feels a bit like addressing the symptoms rather than the root cause. Saying we need secure transport doesn't fully explain why taxi expenditures are on the rise, while the overall budget is shrinking. The lack of transparency about what constitutes essential travel is also a concern. Could there be instances where a taxi is used when a more cost-effective alternative would suffice?
And that's where I start to wonder, is this just about taxis? Or is it a sign of a bigger budgetary issue? Is this just the tip of the iceberg? It does feel like we've stumbled onto something a bit bigger than just a few taxi rides here. The article actually mentions that in 2022, the MoD's spending on hire cars for staff was a whopping £16.6 million, up from $12.9 million the previous year. So this isn't a one-time thing. It seems to be a bit of a trend. And remember, all of this is happening against the backdrop of that massive £29 billion budget shortfall we talked about. It's hard not to see a disconnect there.
It is a significant increase, and it does raise concerns about the MoD's commitment to fiscal responsibility.
Yeah.
Especially in light of everything else we discussed. They do acknowledge they need to control spending, even mentioning some steps they're taking, like cracking down on non-essential consultancy fees.
Oh, okay, so they're at least aware of the problem and trying to do something about it. But is it enough? Are those measures really going to make a dent in that $29 billion shortfall?
Well, that's the million-pound question, isn't it? It's a good sign that they're taking some action. But it remains to be seen whether these steps are sufficiently comprehensive to address the underlying issues. To their credit, the MoD inherited a challenging financial situation. Years of underfunding and shifting priorities have taken their toll.
So it's not like they created this mess overnight, but even so, they're the ones in charge now. They have to make the tough decisions.
Absolutely. While they inherited the problem, they're now responsible for finding solutions. And that means taking a hard look at spending priorities and making difficult choices. There's a need to move beyond simply cutting back on a few expenses here and there, and instead embrace a more strategic approach to budget allocation.
One thing the article touches on that I found interesting is the distinction between different types of transportation. They differentiate between taxis, which seem to be used for more routine travel, and chauffeur-driven cars, which are reserved for ministers and high-ranking officials.
Right, that's an important distinction. It suggests a hierarchy within the system. A taxi to get a group of soldiers to a training exercise is one thing. But a chauffeured car for a single official to attend a meeting, those are two very different scenarios.
So maybe not all taxi spending is created equal. Is there a world where spending on taxis for the military could be justified?
Well, there are certainly situations where a taxi is the most practical or even the most secure option. For instance, imagine a scenario where a high-ranking official needs to travel to a sensitive location at short notice. A taxi, especially one vetted for security, might be the most appropriate choice in that instance. Or consider a situation where a group of soldiers needs to be transported quickly and discreetly. A taxi could offer a level of anonymity that a military vehicle might not. So it's not about demonizing taxis altogether. It's about examining whether their use is always necessary and whether it aligns with the broader goals of fiscal responsibility and strategic planning.
So it's less about saying no taxis ever and more about being smart and strategic. But if we're talking about being smart, what are some of the alternatives the MoD could be looking at? I mean, if taxis aren't always the best option, what else is out there?
That's a great question, and one that deserves more attention. First and foremost, they need to optimize the use of their existing resources. Think about all those military vehicles sitting on bases. Could they be utilized more effectively for routine transport needs? Maybe even create a centralized system to coordinate transport requests and make sure resources are being used efficiently.
I'm picturing like a giant ride-sharing app, Uber for the UK Army.
Exactly. It might sound a little far-fetched, but the underlying concept is sound. We already have the technology to connect riders with available vehicles in real time. There's no reason why that couldn't be applied within the military to reduce reliance on taxis. And it's not just about technology. We also need to think about personnel. Could some roles be relocated to more central locations, reducing the need for constant back-and-forth travel?
That would require some serious logistical planning, but it could lead to long-term cost savings.
Precisely. It's about taking a holistic view, looking at personnel infrastructure technology, and finding the most efficient and cost-effective way to meet those transportation needs. This isn't about cutting corners on security or putting anyone at risk. It's about being intelligent and resourceful. We've already seen how other large organizations, including some militaries around the world, have successfully implemented similar programs to streamline transportation and reduce costs. There's no reason the MoD couldn't learn from their successes and adapt those strategies to their own unique needs.
It sounds like there's a whole world of possibilities, but it also sounds like a major undertaking. Do you think the MoD is equipped to implement these kinds of changes?
That's the real challenge. The MoD is a complex organization with deeply ingrained habits and procedures. Changing those habits, embracing new technologies, and fostering a culture of cost consciousness, that's a tall order. But it's not impossible. It requires strong leadership, a commitment to innovation, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
And maybe a little bit of public pressure to keep the issue on the front burner. Because let's be honest, this isn't just about saving a few quid on taxi fares. It's about something much bigger.
You're absolutely right. This is about accountability, about ensuring that taxpayer money is being spent wisely, and about making sure that the MoD is equipped to face the challenges of a rapidly changing world.
It's about more than just taxis. It's about the future of the UK's defense, and maybe even the future of global security.
Well said. That brings us to a crucial question. What would it take for the MoD to truly embrace these changes? What kind of shift in thinking and culture is needed to move beyond this reliance on taxis and create a more efficient or more responsive and ultimately more effective defense force?
Yeah, it feels like we've uncovered a real tension here. On one hand, there's this pressing need to adapt, to modernize, to be as efficient as possible, especially with, those looming budget concerns. But on the other, you have this massive organization like the MoD, with its established ways of doing things. So how do you bridge that gap? How do you actually make those changes happen?
It's a challenge, no doubt, but I think it starts with acknowledging that change is possible. We've seen it happen in other sectors, even within other militaries.
Right. It's not like we're asking them to invent teleportation here. There are models out there, proven strategies that could be adapted.
Exactly. And there are concrete steps the MoD could take. For starters, they could pilot some of these alternative transport models we've discussed. Imagine a trial run of that Uber for the Army concept at a specific base. Gather data, see how it works in practice, analyze the cost savings.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to argue for wider adoption when you have solid evidence to back it up.
Absolutely. And beyond pilot programs, there's a real opportunity to invest in technology that can streamline operations. We've talked about ride-sharing apps. But think about logistics software that could optimize routes, track vehicle usage, even predict maintenance needs. These are all tools that can lead to significant cost savings in the long run.
But new technology means training, new systems, potentially some pushback from people who are used to doing things a certain way.
Right. That's where leadership comes in. If the message of efficiency and modernization comes from that down, it's more likely to be embraced. And it can't just be about mandates. It's about fostering a culture where people are encouraged to think outside the box, to come up with innovative solutions, and to feel like they're part of the solution.
So maybe part of the answer lies in shifting the mindset, making everyone a stakeholder in the success of the MoD, even down to how people get from point A to point B.
Exactly. It's about making people understand that even seemingly small changes, like choosing a more fuel-efficient vehicle or opting for a video conference instead of an in-person meeting, can have a ripple effect. It all adds up.
And that brings us back to the listener. You might be thinking, well, I'm not in charge of the MoD. What can I do? But the thing is, this isn't just an issue for the military. It's about accountability, transparency, and making sure our resources are being used wisely. Those are values that apply in any organization, even in our own lives.
I couldn't agree more. This deep dive into taxi troubles has really been a deep dive into how we think about spending, about priorities, about adapting to change. And those are lessons we can all apply, whether we're running a country, a business, or just our own household budget.
So the takeaway here isn't never take a taxi. It's about being mindful, asking questions, and challenging the status quo. It's about recognizing that even in a world of shrinking budgets and complex threats, there's always room for innovation and smarter solutions. And who knows, maybe someday we'll see that Uber for the Army app become a reality. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
For another fascinating journey into the world of information,